This is the case of 11-year-old Laura and Hoer, who was abducted, sexually assaulted, and brutally murdered. The girl's face haunted a detective for years, and the agent admitted with his teary eyes that he would see the little girl every time he closed his eyes during those years. On November 6, 1986, Laura disappeared while she was walking home from a gas station in St. Lucie County, Central Florida. After she went missing on November 9th, her dead body was found in a drainage ditch. Her body was immediately sent for an autopsy, and asphyxiation was listed as the cause of death. She had been raped and later strangled to death. The authorities launched an investigation into the murder, but they could not find any physical evidence from the crime scene. The killer murdered the juvenile victim and later altered the crime scene by placing the victim in a drainage ditch in an attempt to destroy all the physical evidence. This move of the killer hinted towards his experience with dealing with crime and evidence. The police found traces of male DNA on Laura's body. The DNA was kept preserved in sexual assault kit as there was no one to match the DNA with. Back then, DNA technology and the criminal database were not advanced enough to provide the authorities with any lead towards the killer. Laura's case eventually went cold in the files of the St. Lucie County Police Department. Nearly 4 decades later, Detective Paul Taylor with the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office reopened the case. I had already been through the crime scene photos, the case file, and what they're telling me does not match what I'm seeing, claimed Detective Paul. Taylor was able to reach out to the original witnesses who had originally spotted Laura. The questioning of the witnesses led him to a fact that it was one of their own deputies who had turned the witnesses away and later moved the body. After the initial point when they found her, a detective showed up. He sent them away from the scene, and the witnesses were never contacted by law enforcement again. In February 2022, Detective Taylor revealed that it was their own former sheriff's deputy, James Howard Harrison, who is now their prime and the only suspect in the killing of the 11-year-old. Harrison was also a church pastor and worked for 10 separate law enforcement agencies since the 1960s. It was Harrison who saw Laura alive for the last time. He abducted her on the way, raped her, and after killing her, he dumped her body in the ditch. I am actually standing there in front of this victim's family, and I'm telling them that one of our deputies is the one who did it. It's rough, stated Detective Taylor. Investigators said Harrison had a pattern of inappropriate behavior with young women. Unfortunately, Harrison was not alive for the authorities to charge him for murder and rape. He died of cancer in 2008, but the detectives got a warrant to exhume his body from the Oakey Cemetery for a DNA sample. But by then, his DNA was too deteriorated to match with the sample found on Laura's body. Detective Taylor said that Harrison was forced to resign from the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office 5 months after the Laura and Hoer homicide, and also was forced to resign from his church because of his sexually inappropriate behavior with young adults. He had been previously accused of molesting children several times. For Laura's older brother, it was disbelieved that his sister's killer was even finally revealed. It naturally was like a dream. After all this time, you're telling me you're able to tell us who murdered our little sister, said her brother. The Hoer family said that they are so grateful to the detective Paul Taylor, who solved this case with immense determination, but they were frustrated with what they believed was a shoddy investigation at the time Laura was killed. From our perspective, things were purposefully overlooked and not done. There were such humongous gaps in the investigation, claimed the Hoer family. The police department now claims that they are now checking their own cold cases around the state because they believe there were other victims of Harrison. What do you guys think? Did the former deputy use his authority as a deputy sheriff and his standing as a preacher in the community to go ahead and violate children during the entire course of his life? How do we keep our women safe from these authoritative men who manipulate the laws and the system for their own evil desires? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This is the story of 23-year-old Christa Bremlet from New Providence, Tennessee, who was found dead in her mobile home during the time when she struggled to find a roof over her head. It took 22 years to solve her murder. Christa Renee Bremlet was born in 1973 in California to Jim Langley and Kim Venable. She was known to be smart, caring, and funny. She was close to her family but chose to be financially independent and lived alone. Christa and her mother had lived together in Clarksville until 1995, when Venable relocated to Texas with Christa's 2 children. Christa remained in Clarksville to complete her GED. Christa lived alone in Clarksville as she worked toward her high school equivalency, so she could make a better life for her 2 young children. Her neighbors called her aloof, but her family called her warm and loving. On Monday, October 28, 1996, Christa's landlord stopped by her mobile home to check on fire damage from the week before when a trash can caught fire. Instead of looking at smoke damage, he saw her shoeless body laying in the flickering glow of a small color television in the living room. Jeff Pennington, the landlord, stated, "At the time of Christa's death, Clarksville police were investigating the killings of several women who had been killed in their homes. Police insisted that the killings were unrelated to this case. With Christa's death, the investigation started with the Clarksville Police Department Crime Scene Unit processing the scene and an autopsy by the Montgomery County Medical Examiner. The autopsy found Christa died by suffocation, and a rape kit found evidence of an assault. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation developed DNA evidence, which was filed with the combined DNA index system. Around 6 detectives started with the neighbors, interviewing between 50 to 60 people to find potential witnesses. One neighbor said she saw Christa on October 27, 1996, sitting on her stoop like she always did. But Christa gave an aloof air, and people usually left her alone. Within a week, police had received nearly dozens of tips and they hoped to have an arrest soon, but the leads didn't go anywhere, there were no potential suspects found, and the years flew by without any arrest. The investigation resulted in more than 1,500 pages of documents. After 22 years, in February 2019, Clarksville police got the call they had been waiting so long for. There was a suspect in Arizona that matched the DNA from Chris' rape kit, 48-year-old Kenneth Hudspeth. Kenneth was an unknown to the police back in 1996, but they didn't suspect he could have had anything to do with Chris' death. CPD cold case detective Michael Allery stated that Hudspeth's name had never surfaced in the initial investigation. Allery interviewed Hudspeth, who admitted to being in Clarksville at the time of Chris' death and to being in her home on the day of her death. Further, Hudspeth did not refute any of the facts of the case as presented to him. Hudspeth lived in the trailer park at the time and moved just after Chris' death in 1997. He had been arrested several times over the years, but his DNA wasn't successfully processed until 2019. Hudspeth was taken into custody on April 16 by Phoenix police and charged with criminal homicide. He will be extradited to Tennessee and booked into the Montgomery County Jail. He claimed he did drugs with Bremlet once before when he lived in the Sunnydale Mobile Home Park in Clarksville. Despite those claims, Bramlet's toxicology report came back clean with a low blood alcohol concentration level. When he was asked if he had sex with her, he first refused, but when shown the autopsy results and the DNA found inside Bremlet and on her bra, he claimed that he was so doped that he doesn't remember if he killed or had sex with Bremlet. "I was on bad dope. I know her. Did I have sex with her? I mean, I don't remember that," said Hudspeth in the courtroom. He further added, "I just don't see myself raping and killing this woman. I hope I didn't." Bramlet's family members were notified as soon as the break in the case was confirmed. "I knew all along that it was just a matter of time. There was never any doubt in our minds that they would find who had done it," said Christa's grandmother. In January 2022, 51-year-old Kenneth Hudspeth was found guilty and sentenced to life prison plus 20 years for the murder of Christa Bremlet. This is the story of 9-year-old Daryl Johnson, whose murder almost resulted in a false execution of an innocent man. The mystery of her death was considered solved for most of 2 decades and then heart-wrenchingly re-emerged as a cold case in 2001. It was 8 a.m. on the morning of February 24, 1982. Daryl was walking 6 blocks from her home to the Lincoln Elementary School, but she never made it. A massive search for the Nampa girl ended 3 days later, when a fisherman found her body next to the Snake River in rural Canyon County. An autopsy revealed that the child had been sexually assaulted and had suffered blunt force injuries to her torso and her head. The police also collected male hair and male DNA from the crime scene. In September 1982, 34-year-old Charles Fain was arrested for Daryl's rape and murder. Mr. Fain was arrested on the basis of a hair sample, which he gave voluntarily to the police, and the fact that he lived a block away from the Johnson family added up to his arrest. After being arrested, Fain denied any involvement in Daryl's murder. He even passed a polygraph test. But despite his denial and passing the test, he was charged with the murder of Daryl Johnson. At his trial, prosecutors mentioned that a shoe print found near the body could have been Fain's. In addition, 2 jailhouse informants testified that they had heard Fain admit to committing the crime, and in exchange for his testimony, the 2 informants received a reduced jail sentence. Despite this buildup against him, Fane remained firm on his argument that he was innocent. He claimed that he was 100 miles away from the block when Darlin was murdered. His testimony was corroborated by the other witnesses. The judge did not rule him out as a suspect. The results of his polygraph test were permitted as evidence in the court, and the DNA technology back then wasn't advanced enough to prove Fane's innocence. On November 4, 1983, Fane was convicted, and in March 1984, he was sentenced to death. For nearly 2 decades, Fane was behind the bars in isolation. Then came 1991. He was just 4 days away from being executed, but surprisingly, his execution was pushed back. In 1999, when the DNA technology was a bit more advanced, it was admitted that hair and DNA found on Daryl's body did not belong to Fane, but to an unknown man. He was then immediately exonerated. In August 1999, he was released from the Idaho Maximum Security Institution. In 2019, investigators reopened the case, and in 2020, using genetic genealogy, they determined a 64-year-old suspect whose DNA matched with the sample found on the crime scene. The suspect was David Dalrymple. He was already serving a 20-to-life prison for kidnapping and abusing a child in 2004. In January 2022, Dalrymple was arrested, was formally charged with taking Daryl's life. He now remains in prison, awaiting his probable another life sentence or the death penalty. On the other hand, Charles Fane is doing well and received a sum of $1.4 million for the wrongful conviction, and with that amount, he recently bought a truck for himself. This is the story of Elizabeth Fritzl that shocked the whole world. Let us start the story with some background on Elizabeth's father, the Austrian pensioner Joseph Fritzl. He was an oppressive patriarchal figure in the family, and the fact that his daughter wanted to go out with her friends, party, kiss her boyfriends, and live her life bothered him to such an extent that he eventually took up criminal means to put chains around her. Joseph's grandfather had been married to a woman who couldn't conceive children. Because of this, the grandfather would have affairs with other women and then would coerce his wife into adopting the children they bore. Joseph's mother was one of those children, whom Mitri, a lawyer, described as unloving and sadistic. It's common that child abusers have often suffered child abuse themselves, and the people who mistreat other people have often been mistreated in various ways themselves. This is no excuse or a justification for the monstrous acts of Joseph, but just a speculation of what could have triggered his descent into pure evil. They are bred and fat over the generations. With that in mind, let us look at what happened to Elizabeth Fritzl during those 24 years in a basement and how it all began. On August 28, 1984, 18-year-old Elizabeth Fritzl went missing. Frantic over the whereabouts of her daughter, Rosemary hastily filed the missing persons report. For weeks, there was no word from Elizabeth, and her parents were left to assume the worst. Then out of nowhere, a letter arrived from Elizabeth claiming that she had grown tired of her family life and ran away. Her father, Joseph, told the policeman who came to the house that he had no idea where she would go. He told the police that she has most likely joined a religious cult, something she had talked previously about doing. But the truth was that Joseph Fritzl knew exactly where his daughter was. She was about 20 feet below where the police officer was standing. Elizabeth was a girl full of dreams and aspirations, and she grew tired of her father consistently imposing harsh restrictions on her. She had previously expressed to her mother and her sister about her interest in leaving the family, traveling around the country, and starting a new life on her own as soon as she would turn 18. Joseph overheard this conversation and decided to do something about it. On August 28, 1984, Joseph called his daughter into the basement of the family's home. He was refitting a door to the newly renovated cellar and needed help carrying it. As Elizabeth held the door, Joseph fixed it into place. As soon as it was on the hinges, he swung it open, forcing Elizabeth inside and knocking her unconscious with an ether-soaked towel. For the next 24 years, the inside of the dirt-walled cellar would be the only thing Elizabeth Fritzl would see. Her father would lie to her mother and the police, feeding them stories about how she had run away and joined a cult. The police investigation into her whereabouts would run cold, and before long, the world would forget about the missing Fritzl girl. But Joseph Fritzl wouldn't forget, and over the next 24 years, he would make that very clear to his daughter. For the rest of the Fritzl family, Joseph was a hard-working husband and a father who was thoroughly dedicated to his career. For them, he would head down to the basement every morning at 9 a.m. to draw plans for the machines that he sold. And occasionally, he would spend the night there. Yosef's wife never doubted the actions or the intentions of her husband since she didn't know what disgusting acts were happening right beneath her feet. At the minimum, Yosef would visit his daughter in the basement 3 times a week. Usually, it was every day. For the first 2 years, he left her alone in captivity. Then he began to rape her, continuing the nightly visits he had begun when she had not even entered the adult phase of her life. 2 years into her captivity, Elizabeth became pregnant and she miscarried 10 weeks into the pregnancy. 2 years later, she fell pregnant again, this time carrying to term. In August of 1988, a baby girl named Kirsten was born, and 2 years later, she gave birth to another baby boy named Stefan. Kirsten and Stefan remained in the cellar with their mother for the duration of her imprisonment, and Joseph brought weekly rations of food and water for them. Elizabeth attempted to teach them with the rudimentary education she herself had and gave them the most normal life she could, under their horrific circumstances. Over the next 24 years, Elizabeth Fritzl gave birth to 5 more children. 1 more was allowed to remain in the basement with her. 1 died shortly after birth and the other 3 were taken upstairs to live with Rosemary and Joseph. In order to conceal what he was doing from Rosemary, he staged elaborate discoveries of the children. He often placed them on bushes near the home or sometimes on the doorstep. Each time, the child was swaddled neatly and accompanied with a note allegedly written by Elizabeth claiming that she couldn't take care of the baby and was leaving it with her parents for safekeeping. Shockingly, social services never questioned the appearance of the children and allowed the Fritzls to keep them as their own children. Officials, on the other hand, remained under the impression that Rosemary and Joseph were the baby's grandparents. It is not known for how long Joseph Fritzl intended to keep his daughter captive in his basement. He had gotten away with it for 24 years. And for all the police knew, he was going to continue probably for another 24. However, in 2008, one of the children in the cellar fell ill. Elizabeth begged her father to allow her 19-year-old daughter, Kirsten, to get medical attention. She had fallen rapidly and critically ill, and Elizabeth was beside herself. Grudgingly, Joseph agreed to take her to a hospital. He removed Kirsten from the cellar and called an ambulance, claiming that he had a note from Kristen's mother explaining her condition. She looked like a ghost. She was seriously ill, her only relative, a mysterious grandfather. The police eventually grew suspicious of Joseph and reopened the investigation into Elizabeth Fritzl's disappearance. They began to read the letters that Elizabeth had supposedly been leaving for the Fritzls, and began to see inconsistencies in them. Police questioned Kirsten and also asked the public for any information on her family. Naturally, no one came forward as there was no family to speak of. Whether Joseph finally felt the pressure or had a change of heart regarding his daughters, but on April 26, 2008, he released Elizabeth from the cellar for the first time in 24 years. She immediately went to the hospital to see her daughter, where hospital staff alerted police to her suspicious arrival. That night, she was taken into custody to be questioned about her daughter's illness and her father's story. After making the police promise that she never had to see her father again, Elizabeth Fritzl told the tale of her 24-year imprisonment. She explained that her father kept her in a basement and that she bore his 7 children. She explained that Joseph was the father of all 7 of them and that Joseph Fritzl would come down during the night, make her watch pornographic films, and then rape her. She explained that he'd been abusing her ever since she was 11. The police arrested Joseph Fritzl that very same night. After the arrest, the children in the cellar were also released and Rosemary Fritzl fled the home. She had allegedly known nothing about the events taking place right under her feet, and Joseph backed up her story. The tenants who had lived in the apartment on the first floor of the Fritzl home also never knew what was happening right beneath them, as Joseph had explained away all the sounds by blaming faulty piping and a noisy heater. Prior to his trial, Joseph confessed to the repeated rapes, claiming that the rape of his daughter was an addiction and the redirection of incestuous feelings he felt towards his own mother. He also claimed to be a loving, attentive father to the children he sired in the basement, bringing them books and stuffed animals, watching videos, and eating dinner with the children just like a family. At the trial, the father admitted guilt on an incest charge but pled innocent to enslavement and to the murder of his child. After he saw Elizabeth's taped testimony, he changed his plea to full guilt, acknowledging that his failure to secure medical care for the newborn may have directly contributed to the death. For his crimes, Fritzl was found guilty on all counts: negligent murder, enslavement, incest, rape, coercion, and false imprisonment. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in 2009. He has been in solitary confinement in Austria's Kremstein prison since that time. According to Austrian media, he now suffers from dementia and none of his family has visited during his decade behind bars. Elisabeth Fritzl lives under a new identity in a secret Austrian village known only as Village X. The home is under constant CCTV surveillance and police patrol every corner. The family doesn't allow interviews anywhere within their walls and has declined to give any information about themselves. Though she is now in her mid-50s, the last photo taken of her was when she was just 16 years of age. How do you form an intimate relationship after the people who are supposed to protect you have done so many horrible things to you? What do you guys think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Seaside town of Rothesay on the Isle of Bute is a picturesque place to live or visit. Located off the Scottish coast, it has a population of just over 4,500 people and is popular with tourists, holidaymakers, and families alike. It's frequently voted a beautiful place to visit with some extraordinary scenery, and there is a wonderful sense of community spirit. Everyone knows each other and people often leave their doors unlocked. However, the safety and security of this tight-knit community would be shattered one summer night in 2018. Alicia Mackle was born on October 22, 2011 to parents Georgina and Robert. Although her parents had separated when she was a baby, she remained their absolute priority and they both doted on her. She was bright, inquisitive, and loved being around people. She was described by her teacher as someone who loved to learn and always took great pride in her own work. Alicia was very friendly and welcomed everyone first thing in the morning at breakfast club. She was a considerate child who loved being part of a group, and she was popular with all the other children. Her mother Georgina lived in North Lanarkshire with Alicia's younger sister Courtney, and her father Robert lived on the Isle of Bute with his parents. The island is where Alicia would frequently spend time. Her parents ensured that she would see as much as she could of Robert and his parents too. She would spend every other weekend on the island, and in the summer of 2018 she made a trip over there to start her summer holidays. On the evening of July 1st at around 11 p.m., Toni McLaughlin, who was the girlfriend of Alicia's father Robert, said she checked on Alicia and saw that she was sound asleep in her bed. Knowing this, she too called it a night and headed to bed herself. As this community was small and close-knit, the key was left in the front door. While Toni was checking on Alicia, a teenage boy named Aaron Campbell was in the midst of a house party, getting drunk and celebrating the end of his exams. 16-year-old Aaron also lived on the island, having moved there at a young age from England with his parents, Jeanette and Christopher, and his younger sister. He would describe his home life as difficult. He claimed he frequently argued and fought with his mother and alleged that she drank heavily. His father was often absent due to his line of work. However, people that know the family disagree and say that both parents were very kind and loving. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Aaron Campbell on the surface was a popular and seemingly charismatic young man. He even had his own YouTube channel. He documented various things about his life, including his sporting activities. As he got older, he began dabbling with drugs and alcohol and having darker and more extreme thoughts and impulses, such as fantasizing about rape, and he even went as far to say he might kill one day for the lifetime experience. He had a history of self-harming and depression and was even entered into a rehabilitation program for starting fires. The party was being held at Campbell's house, and as it continued into the early hours of the morning, his behavior began to change. It resulted in him having an argument with his mother, telling people he felt suicidal and saying he just wanted to get stoned. Using Facebook Messenger, Campbell tried to contact Toni, attempting to buy drugs. According to the Facebook messages, there had recently been a falling out between Robert Mackle and Aaron, with Aaron alleging the quality of the cannabis wasn't good enough. Failing to get hold of Toni, he decided to head to their house, which was only a few minutes walk away. With him, he took a kitchen knife. As Alicia's grandfather Callum woke up for work at 6 a.m., he went to check on his granddaughter, but found her bed empty. He immediately alerted Robert and Toni, who subsequently contacted the police. Upon checking her phone, Toni saw the missed calls and messages from Campbell and attempted to call him back. He messaged her back saying it didn't matter anymore, with several laughing emojis. She quickly told him that Alicia had gone missing, and he replied, "Oh damn, I'm sure she's not went too far." Later that day, Aaron would send a Snapchat out to his friends with the caption, "Found the guy that done it." It's not uncommon for communities to band together when cases like these arise, and Rothsey was no exception. A huge manhunt began. Members of the public, a helicopter, and the Coast Guard joined the search, and police for more help were sent out via Facebook. Shortly after the search began, they found what they were looking for. At around 9 a.m., the police were called as a local man had discovered Alicia's lifeless and naked body in a wooded area about 15 minutes from her home. Tragically, her mother Georgina would find this out via Facebook. The autopsy concluded that Alicia had sustained 117 injuries, and the pathologist would refer to these injuries as catastrophic. On the July 21st, Alicia's funeral was held with hundreds of mourners in attendance. One of the people grieving the loss of Alicia and who was involved in the initial search for her was Jeanette Campbell, Aaron's mother. Looking for answers and anything she could do to help, she decided to check her CCTV cameras installed outside her home in the hopes of picking anything up. Upon looking at the footage, her heart dropped. She watched her own son entering and leaving the house twice around the hour as Alicia was believed to have gone missing. After asking him about this, she decided to turn the footage into the police as a way of eliminating Aaron. The police brought Aaron Campbell in for questioning as a witness, but he remained calm and collected, showing no signs of any wrongdoing. He told them he was simply heading out to buy cannabis. As part of the interview process, the police looked into Campbell's phone, which began to show the true, horrifying picture. They uncovered the Snapchat he had sent out, the Facebook messages to Tony, and evidence that he had been Googling how DNA would be uncovered at a crime scene. Following these discoveries, they would match Aaron's DNA to the DNA found on Alicia's body. The chances of it being anybody else were more than 1,000,000,000 to 1. He was swiftly arrested on suspicion of murder and charged the following day. At first, he answered no comments, but later he would claim that he and Tony had been pursuing an affair and that after having sex in the garage that evening, she had saved the condom and planted his DNA at the murder scene. After more interrogations, the horror surrounding what had really happened that night to Alicia Mackle were becoming clear. At around 2 a.m., Campbell entered the unlocked home belonging to Robert Mackle and his parents. Initially, he claimed to steal drugs. However, he found 6-year-old Alicia asleep. He would later tell a psychologist that once he saw her, all he thought about was killing her, referring to it as a moment of opportunity. He picked her up and left. Alicia began to wake up after a short time and asked him what was happening. He told her he was a friend of her father's and even gave her his t-shirt to keep her warm. The events that transpired are nothing short of horrific. Alicia was raped and brutally murdered. Campbell then threw her clothes into the sea and dumped her naked body in the woodlands before heading home to have a shower and clean off any evidence. He returned to the murder scene a short while later to retrieve his phone. When it came time for him to enter his plea, Aaron Campbell pled not guilty. The trial began in February 2019 with Judge Lord Matthews presiding. Campbell's behavior would shock the courtroom. His lack of remorse showed as he struggled not to laugh as the evidence was being presented. He would eventually say he was quite satisfied with the murder and appeared to revel in and take pride in what he had done. Following a conversation with a psychologist, Aaron Campbell would finally admit to everything shortly before his sentencing. The trial lasted 9 days and the jury took just 3 hours to find him unanimously guilty on all counts. Aaron showed no emotion as the jury fed back their verdict. Because he was under the age of 18 at the time he was found guilty, his name and images were not printed. Media outlets argued it was in the public interest to know, and as a result, for the first time in Scottish criminal history, Judge Lord Matthews agreed to reverse the naming restriction. On the 21st of March 2019, Aaron Thomas Campbell was sentenced to 27 years in prison for the abduction, rape, and murder of Alicia Mackle. This sentence would later be reduced by 3 years after Campbell made a successful appeal. Upon sentencing, Judge Lord Matthews described Campbell's arrogance and callousness as breathtaking and spoke of the profound effect the crime had on the island's community. Since his sentencing, Aaron Campbell has been disowned by his family, and police officers and detectives have warned that he bears such a threat to society he should never be released. However, should he be released at the end of his sentence, he will be just 40 years old. Almost a year after her death and a huge public donation, Alicia's memory was honored by her old primary school. They built a large wooden playhouse decorated with unicorns and butterflies. They said it was inspired by how much Alicia loved her friends and loved talking to people. They wanted to create a safe space for children to be together and make friends. The murder of Alicia Mackle was a crime that shook the United Kingdom, and her family and friends are determined that she will never be forgotten. Bethany Decker was born in Fredericksburg, Virginia. She was bright and hardworking, studying global and economic change at George Mason University as well as working a full-time job. Whilst at university, she started a relationship with Army National Guardsman Emil Decker. She became pregnant and the pair married in 2009, welcoming a baby boy soon after. Due to his job in the military, he was often deployed to Afghanistan. And when her husband was away, Bethany was able to balance her responsibilities with the help of her in-laws, who would watch her son while she worked and went to school. The marital bliss was not to last, however, as while working as a waitress, she met an immigrant from Bolivia called Ronald Roldan, and before long, the two were pursuing an affair. Bethany and Emil's marital woes began to show. She moved out into an apartment on Orchard Grass Terrace in Ashburn, Virginia. Ronald moved in soon after, and the relationship proved toxic. Ronald was extremely controlling. He would contact her throughout the day, demanding she send pictures of where she was and who she was with. Bethany was trapped and her family started thinking of ways to get her out. But by the end of the year, Bethany had fallen pregnant again. As she'd maintained a romantic relationship with Emil while he was on leave, the father of her child remains unclear. After returning from deployment in January of 2011, Emil and Bethany went on holiday to Hawaii. After coming back, they stayed with Emil's parents, who were unaware of the strains on their marriage. The next morning, January 29th, Emil saw Bethany before she went back to the apartment she shared with Ronald. She called him to work to confirm what shift she would be working the following week, and Ronald says he saw her that afternoon. Emil was redeployed on the 2nd of February, and Bethany did not come to the airport to say goodbye, and her absence was put down to their relationship problems. This was not rare. People could often go a few days without hearing from Bethany, as her life was a busy balancing act of parenting, school, and work. She remained active on Facebook and was still sending messages to friends. However, it was these messages that would arouse suspicion. A few of Bethany's friends contacted her mother, Kim Nelson, to explain that they had received messages from Bethany's account, but they did not believe she was the one writing and sending them. On February 19th, Kim asked her parents to visit Bethany and Ronald's apartment to see if she was okay. They noticed that her car was still in the parking lot, but it looked abandoned, dusty, with a flat tire and parked at an awkward angle. After banging on the front door and not getting a response, panic began to set in. They raised the alarm and reported her missing. Initial inquiry is gravely concerned investigators. Her bank accounts had not been touched. Her phone records showed that it had not been used since her last known whereabouts of January 29th. She had failed to turn up at work and had not been seen at her university. It quickly became apparent that there was a love triangle, so Emil and Ronald became focuses of the investigation. After contacting Emil, he returned home to speak to the police. Ronald explained to investigators that he thought she had simply returned to live with her parents. Police looked into Ronald's background further and discovered he had a string of previous convictions, including identity theft and destruction of property after smashing a woman's car window. He was not able to give consistent answers when questioned about when he had seen Bethany's car parked outside. As Ronald had moved out, they obtained a warrant to search his new address. They seized phones and a laptop, but no new evidence would come of this. During this time, Emil was granted a divorce from the missing Bethany. Ronald has only ever made one public statement on the disappearance of Bethany Decker, which he made through his attorney. "My client remains hopeful and prays daily that Bethany will come home. He has complete confidence they are working hard on the case." In the years after her disappearance, Ronald began a relationship with a woman named Vicky Willoughby. Like his relationship with Bethany Decker, it quickly became abusive and controlling. During a fight, Vicky pulled a gun on Ronald. He wrestled the weapon away from her and shot her 3 times. Vicky would miraculously survive, but would lose an eye and live with the emotional scars forever. No charges were filed against her, as it was deemed that she had acted in self-defense. He pleaded guilty to 2 felony assault charges and was sentenced to 6 to 8 years in prison. She would talk about her experiences on an episode of the hit TV show Dr. Phil, and she said in an interview with the Daily Mail, "Another girl is going to get hurt by this man. It's a terrible injustice, not just for me, but for the next girl he attacks." Once Ronald has served his sentence, proceedings will begin to deport him from the United States. There is no evidence that Bethany ever gave birth to the baby she was carrying at the time of her disappearance, and no trace of her has ever been found. If you have any information relating to the disappearance or whereabouts of Bethany Decker, please contact the relevant authorities. Number 4. The mysterious circumstances surrounding the disappearance of Marcia Brantley have captured the attention of the press and public for years.